Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. I have a great guest on today. His name is Ben Burgis. He's a Jacobin columnist and the host of Give Them an Argument podcast, also an adjunct professor. Ben, thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
With everything going on in Gaza, there's so much to talk about in regards to how you view what's going on there. I guess just very succinctly, how would you define Zionism in your own words, and how do you find it most problematic from a philosophical and political standpoint?
Sure. So Zionism is Jewish ethno-nationalism. So the idea that Israel is sort of rightly or properly the homeland of the Jewish people, and that it should be like the nation state that expresses that desire, right? I mean, that's what Zionism is. I think that's a pretty like neutral definition. I don't think like any Zionist really would have a problem with the way that I just defined it. And the reason that I have a problem with it is that first part about ethno nationalism. So different forms of nationalism around the world go on a spectrum from pure civic nationalism, where the nation is just whoever lives within the nation's borders, and that's it, regardless of race, religion, ancestry, anything else, and pure ethno nationalism, where the nation is this like ethnic unit, right? It's some sort of demographic within that territory based on some kind of like ancestral blood and soil connection to the country. And Israel, Israeli nationalism, Zionism, is a pretty pure form of ethno nationalism. And that seems really bad to me because if the nation is defined in ethnic terms, then that means that there are lots of people who live within the nation who don't count as much as everybody else by definition. At best, members of minority groups who don't have the right ancestral blood and soil connection to the land are something like well-treated guests, and of course the worst gets much much worse. And I guess the last thing I would say about this is just everything I've been saying so far is just what my problem would be with ethno-nationalism anywhere, period, right? In principle, because you asked kind of philosophically. But I think it's particularly bad to try to carve out a Jewish ethno state in these circumstances because there are lots of places in the world where if you're an ethno nationalist, you think that country should be like the country of like some ancestral unit of people who are there. Then the worst thing that might lead you to do is to have like really restrictive immigration policies, right? Say, oh, we're not going to let in members of other groups. And to be clear, I think that's very bad. I'm against racist immigration policies, but that's kind of nothing compared to what you have to do to maintain this ethno nationalist project under the conditions of the Middle East, where you have these millions of other people there who don't fit into it. And so starting in 1948 onward, that's led to sort of escalating human rights violations, leading to what's going on right now in Gaza.
Absolutely. And, piggybacking off of that, a lot of people now, especially, we're seeing a huge shift on the conservative right. Do you see Zionism as a fitting, part of the framework of Western imperialism? I'm seeing this movement where people are trying to distinguish it from Western imperialism and blaming the Jewish people for it specifically as if it's not part of that much larger system.
Well, this is one of those interesting things that if you compare what the founders of the Zionist project said to what people say right now, you often get this very weird disconnect, right? So sometimes now you'll get people will sort of like indignantly deny that Zionism has anything to do with Western imperialism, whereas if you go back and read like Theodore Herzl, who's like, yes, this will be great because it'll be like an outpost of Western civilization in the Middle East, right? So I think it's kind of crazy to act as if Zionism has nothing to do with Western imperialism. I mean, certainly since, at least the 1960s, the United States has been the chief patron of Israel. I mean, it's a little bit complicated before that, that the Soviet Union supported them when they first started out. In fact, I think when people think about Stalin's crimes, they should probably add that one to the list. In 1948, providing arms to Israel during the Nakba. But certainly for the last several decades, the United States has given more or less unlimited back-in and diplomatic cover to Israel doing whatever it wants, and that's not like why it's bad per se, right? I think that expansionism and apartheid and all of these things are very bad, regardless of like what other forces in the world are sponsoring or supporting it. And certainly you mentioned people blaming Jewish people. It's like, well, look, I mean, that's I think it's ridiculous to divide the world up into ethnic hive minds as if as if everybody who's a member of a group is collectively responsible for for what other members of that group do, right? I mean that I mean Israel is no more identical with with Jews as a collective entity than Saudi Arabia is with Muslims as a collective entity, or the apartheid South Africa is of like all white people everywhere, anything like that, right? But so I think that I think the question is, well, whose fault is it? If that's the question we're interested in, well, I mean, it's primarily the fault of the Israeli state. They're the ones who've been actually doing this stuff. But close second is the West, especially the United States, for backing the project to the hilt.
Absolutely. And that's nuanced because from the United States perspective, there is actual benefits the United States receives from a imperialist standpoint of having Israel in the Middle East. And there's also a very real, strong, powerful Israel lobby in the United States that has its own agendas. Uh, if you could put that on a scale, do you feel like the U.S. imperialist agenda is the driving factor versus the Israeli influence and the pressure that they put in the United States to receive that backing? Because how do you go about that in your head? How do you view that situation?
I mean, I would be reluctant to try to put a number on either one. I mean, it's what's clearly true historically is that the United States at one point was a bit ambivalent about Israel. If you go back to the 40s and 50s, I think that certainly post 1956, right? They became much less ambivalent, and then certainly, I mean, certainly if you get to like the 6 Day War and all of that, the United States has more or less been all in. I will say that in recent years, it's tipped over to kind of the point of absurdity. And I mean, if you go back even to the 1980s, when Israel was in Lebanon, you do get these famous incidents like Ronald Reagan, calling the then Prime Minister of Israel to tell them to back off, and saying, okay, this has gone too far, right? You're killing too many people, and that has become sort of unimaginable more recently. I mean, you really can't imagine Donald Trump or Joe Biden doing the Reagan phone call, and so maybe you can say that shows you something about the way that the Israel lobby and which certainly exists. I mean, it's kind of silly to pretend that that's not a major factor, which people sometimes do, right? Like there's this weird game that people play where like if like I don't know Ilhan Omar, somebody says, oh, the Israel lobby spends a lot of money and that has something to do with what goes on in American politics. People act shocked by that.
Yeah.
But like, surely if there was a APAC board meeting and somebody was like, oh, I just did a study and it turns out that all the money we've been spending has zero effect on American politics, everybody would be horrified by that, right? Like that's that, it's like, oh no, we've been wasting all this money, like we're not moving the needle at all in our direction. So I think that I think that lobbying activity certainly has a lot to do with it. I think the cultural politics of American evangelicals has a lot to do with it. I mean, I think it's kind of a devil's brew of a lot of things coming together in just in just the right way. But I guess all of which is to say, I mean, I know this hasn't been like a really decisive answer, which is just because like I'm not sure, right? I think there's a
Yeah,
lot going on here, and like how to weigh it all is a little bit hard to say. But like maybe the last thing I'd say about this is just I think that oftentimes when people talk about this, well, how much does this serve the interests of American imperialism? I think people get sucked into making this bad assumption, which is that empires are just like totally rational actors that do these sort of perfect calculations of the costs and benefits to them before they do things. I actually think I actually think empires very often do things to like assert their own power that end up being like wildly counterproductive.
absolutely. And I feel like that's actually what's happening now because there's something to say about the more the United States unrelentingly backs Israel, it further isolates the United States. I personally don't feel like this can fare well for the United States in the long term, this sort of foreign entanglement. What's your stance on that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty clear that there are a lot of ways in which this is very bad for us. Whether by us you mean ordinary Americans, of course, right, who are getting nothing out of it, but even in terms of kind of cynical imperial self interest, it seems it seems like at this point it's very hard to see what the case is that this is a net positive. I mean, like at one time maybe you could argue, again, I mean, not from any perspective I care about, but from a sort of like cold blooded, Kissingerian kind of realism, right? You might be able to say, okay, well, the United States was trying to counteract, Soviet influence in the Middle East and this and that. And, and like maybe it worked out well for imperial self interest overall. But right now, this just seems to be causing a lot of chaos and a lot of resentment of the United States for very little payoff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And from a Marxist perspective, I was curious to know specifically your kind of thoughts on how you would view it from this lens. Does capitalism fuel conflicts like the one that we're seeing in Palestine? How and the role that profit motive play in this entire situation? How would you approach that from that sort of lens?
Yeah, sure. So I want to be a little bit careful about this because I really don't think it's as simple as just we do these things because weapons companies profit off of them or whatever, right? I mean, I don't think that's nowhere in the explanation, right? But I don't think that's like the primary thing
Yeah,
that's going on. And I think that would be way too reductive. I think that I think there may be two things to be said about this in terms of thinking about this through a Marxist lens. One of which is about the political economy of Israel, and the other is about the political economy of the United States. So, as far as Israel goes, I do think it's really important for what's going on, that this is, people bandy around this word a lot, and there are oftentimes I think people's reactions to it are much more driven by vibes than analysis, right? That sort of what you think somebody is probably getting at when they use the term rather than how literally applicable it is, right? But I do think that talking about settler colonialism is relevant to thinking about the political economy of Israel Palestine, just because when you're talking about different ways that colonization, which again is a word that early Zionists had no problem with. They used it all the time. Later Zionists have gotten, have started to feel differently about it. But if you think about different ways, different colonization projects have gone on in different parts of the world. There is an important difference, like Karl Kautsky talked about this in the early 20th century. He talked about exploitation colonies versus work colonies, between colonial projects where the goal is to exploit the labor of the people who already live there, and colonial projects where the goal is to push those people out, and so your labor force is primarily going to be new people that you're bringing in. And I think that is a really important distinction for understanding the dynamics of what's going on in Israel, what makes it different even from like South Africa, for example. That's like a country that you'll often see Israel compared to, and I think for very good reasons. I think that a lot of what's morally objectionable about Israel's system is very similar to what was morally objectionable about South Africa's system. But the kind of key difference and the reason why you never saw that sort of tip over into outright genocidal, like assaults on like Bantustans in South Africa, is because that actually was the labor force that was being exploited, and Black South Africans were needed for that purpose in a way that unfortunately Palestinians are not, for the Israeli economy, right? I mean, this is so. I think this helps to explain why things were able to tip over into outright genocide. And I want to make clear one clarification on that, right? Because I think people might mishear, right, what I'm saying when I say that, because sometimes people use these phrases to mean lots of different things. And so, I think sometimes, and like sometimes when people are used to hearing that phrase, settler colonialism, it's associated with this sort of normative political program that's like all Israeli Jews, like all Israeli Jews are settlers, even if you're like a third generation resident of Tel Aviv, and like everybody should just like go back to some ancestral point of origin or something. I don't think any of that, right? I think that I think that everybody belongs wherever they, wherever they live. I don't believe that any human being is sort of. I don't believe that any human being doesn't belong in wherever they were born, right? Like just like the ANC didn't advocate the removal of white South Africans, right? I would never advocate the removal of Israeli Jews. But I do think if we're just doing a snap, so I think that the vision for the future, ideally, would just be a democratic state with equal rights for everybody, and refugees can come back and all of that, right? I think that would be my by far my normative preference, and it's very hard to see the road from here to there. But then again, it's also very hard to see the road from here to a two-state solution. Right now it would take a massive, unpredictable geopolitical earthquake to get either of those things to happen, right? So my preference would be for the first one, ideally, right? So that's what I'd want to happen. But if we're going to talk about the political economy of the present, then I think settler colonialism is a pretty relevant analytic frame. And then the last thing I would say, as far as thinking about all this through a Marxist angle, is because I think this maybe is what you were more getting at, originally with the question anyway, is about the political economy of the United States, because how that can help explain why things like this happen in the first place. And I think that the bigger question isn't so much about like how is it that Joe Biden decided in 2023 that that he was going to go all in on this, because I think that if you're asking questions like that, then sort of big sort of world historical analytic frameworks like Marxism aren't going to be that helpful, because you're going to be talking about things that are much sort of finer grain, much closer to home explaining that in terms of Joe Biden's background and his worldview and the different pressures brought to bear by different lobbies in Washington and the internal politics of the Democratic Party and all that stuff, right? I think where a framework like Marxism is going to be more relevant is for thinking about much bigger picture questions about how we got here in the first place. So I think the question is like, how is it the case that we have this massive military industrial complex that can do things like maintain hundreds of bases around the world, fund two simultaneous proxy wars in entirely different parts of the world at the same time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that's so obviously insulated from American public opinion, right?
Yeah.
That it doesn't matter how many people want to want a ceasefire, for example, right? That it's walled off from that. And I think that if you want to understand that picture, then understanding the class structure of American society is actually going to be incredibly relevant, right? Because if this, if ordinary working class people, actually had substantive power over the economic foundations of our society and how that expresses itself politically. I mean, like, we wouldn't have these priorities. I mean, this is insane this isn't maintaining the kind of massive military footprint around the world that can do these things. I mean, we could argue about how it does or doesn't benefit the empire, but like it certainly doesn't benefit the majority of Americans. But we have an economic system that leads to a distribution of wealth, economic power, and political influence where most people just don't have much of a say.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on something important. There's, of course, the United States' military force and imperialist stance there. And then there's also Israel's expansionist policies in the West Bank, southern Lebanon, even Syria. So, I feel like with both Israel and the United States, you can only expand and expand your power so much until you simply stretch yourself out thin. I mean, it seems like that's a little bit of what influenced the fall of the Roman Empire. Can this go on forever? From just like it seems like there's already especially with the national debt here in the United States. I feel like we're stretching ourselves out thin. I feel like Israel will be stretching itself out thin. Could this backfire for both countries, both of their imperialist agendas? And do you see that? What's your thoughts on that overall? It's such a big question, but
No, but I think that's probably right. I mean, I think there's a question about time scale, right? About how long it takes, of course. But yeah, I mean, look, I think that in the Israeli case in particular, it's an important point, right? The Israeli half of the equation, because this is a small country. If you sort of subtract U.S. support, it's still got a fairly thriving economy and all of that. But ultimately, this is a fairly small country that has relatively limited resources. And there's this narrative that you see a lot that the United States, even if the United States cut off all aid to Israel, it wouldn't matter because, if anything, they'd be less restrained because Netanyahu wouldn't have to worry about pissing off his American backers. And like this is, the way that the narrative goes is, well, they're just so crazy. They would just do it all anyway, right? It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't help. Like I've been seeing people, maybe less so lately, right? But I've been seeing people say variations of that for a couple, for the last couple of years. And I think for exactly the reason your question points to, that's just really implausible because, if you're going to fight, I mean, I don't remember how many wars they say, how many fronts they say they're up to at this point, right? They like, I think Netanyahu said something a little while back where he listed off like 8, although one of those I think was the information war, but like there is only so long you can keep doing that, right? And I mean, this is why even like the question about, the U.S. funding the Iron Dome is so important because If um, because money is fungible, right? If you have to spend 500 million on that, right? Then you have 500 million less to spend on other things. Bombing Syria, bombing Lebanon. Protecting settler militias in the West Bank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I think that in Israel's case, particularly, I just have a hard time imagining that they would be willing to act anything like this. I mean, that they, like fighting this many enemies at once as aggressively as they've been doing if they didn't think that they were going to continually get the gas tank refilled by Uncle Sam. And then, yeah, I mean, there is a question about how long Uncle Sam can continue to do it on our end. And I think there the resources are much greater, but I also think that there are real trade-offs. I mean, even people who are like big believers in MMT, right, modern monetary policy, so like deficits don't matter in the way that we normally think they do, and all that stuff. Even those people will still acknowledge it's like, yeah, but like the actual physical resources represented by all these allocations are ultimately limited. You do face trade-offs about how much of it you can spend on one purpose forever without having enough for another, which is why I think one of the things that's most important that people in the United States can do um, to benefit the Palestinians and also everybody else who's a victim of America's kind of global imperial military premise, military footprint is just to demand that more resources be spent here at home, right? On meeting people's cellular needs to force some of those guns versus butter trade-offs, because ultimately, you don't have on any theory of the economy, you don't have an unlimited amount of resources to spend on everything forever, and so ultimately, money spent, killing Palestinians, money spent, killing people with drones in different countries, all of that stuff is money that's not being spent on us here.
Absolutely. And when you were mentioning the time scale of just how long this imperialist agenda can go, if we just focus on the United States as well, if we saw it as a curve on a graph where it's peaking in its power and it's on the decline, where do you see the United States just based on historical trends? Where do you feel the United States is right now?
Yeah, I mean that's a tricky question. I guess I'm not sure. I do think that after the fall of the Soviet Union, that we were on this kind of high for a while. That this is the only superpower in the world. We can do whatever we want forever. I mean that's certainly the kind of circumstances that led to the Iraq War happening, most obviously. And I do think that that's starting to change a little bit, right? That I don't want to exaggerate how much, because the United States is clearly still, by far the most dominant, power in the world. I think that, the number of, China has like two external military bases, right? I mean, this is, like there's really no comparison there. So I don't want to exaggerate too much, but it's like I do think a more multilateral world is inevitable. I mean, it's sort of like whether that's even a good thing or not. I mean, it's not. I mean, it could be depending on how it plays out, right? Or it could just be like having more gangs fight over the same territory, which is not necessarily good for the people who get caught in the crossfire. But I think whether it's good or bad, it is inevitable, and I think you are already. I mean, even in things like the war in Ukraine, where that it's been this kind of bloody stalemate, for a long time, and this push and pull, and it seems like if anything, time is ultimately on the Russian side. I mean, stuff like that, I think, is a reminder that even though the United States is still the biggest, most dominant sort of imperial colossus right now, ultimately, I mean, other powers are going to be able to do things on their own initiative, and the ability of the United States to the ability of the United States to control everything that happens everywhere. I mean, it was never really absolute. That was always an illusion, but it's even getting to be much less than it was.
Absolutely. And there's, the question of how can the United States do it? And the political environment here in the United States, public opinion is shifting. So how much will that eventually influence the timescale? It seems like we're seeing a huge shift in support for Israel, both among the left and the right, which has been pretty interesting to see, especially over the last couple of years. You've written about political hypocrisy on the left previously. How does that manifest in discussions around identity politics and support for Zionism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that. Sorry, I was just thinking about it. That's a big question. So I guess probably in a couple of ways uh, that certainly, I mean, the classic way that it used to manifest, and that it's not like this like doesn't still exist. I just think it exists much less than it did before. Is the PEP thing, right? Progressives, except for Palestine, people who sort of have generally left wing views on other subjects, but they'd carve out an exemption for that. And I think those public opinion shifts that you're talking about are, I think there's just much less room for that than there once was. Than certainly on the left, and like not just what we would really think of as like the left, but like even sort of like the vaguely progressive side of the political spectrum. I mean, if you look at polls like support for Israel among like Democratic voters has just completely collapsed.
Yeah.
It's still Democratic politicians. It hasn't, right, but voters it has. And yeah, even on the right, there is this interesting shift where younger conservatives, are have often moved in the right direction on this. So yeah, I think all that's real, and so I think all that has left less room, for the PEP thing than had existed for a long time, which is a very good thing. I do think, kind of going back to some of what I was saying earlier, in the settler colonialism discussion, that a lot of people aren't really kind of thinking about or framing some of this stuff in the way that I would most prefer them to, and that I think would be most sort of consistent with broader left values, because I think a lot of people, whatever, in American culture in general, but the left isn't immune from it, do tend to divide the world into ethnic hive minds, and sort of think in terms of like entire groups of people, and like sort of, I like this one, I don't like that one, right, in ways that I think really miss the point that the core of the left project has always been this deep egalitarianism that everybody deserves the same things just for being a person. And so people end up getting caught up in these arguments that I don't really think matter, right? About certain aspects of the history, and if your ancestors lived somewhere thousands of years ago, do you count as the original inhabitants, or is there a statute of limitations on that, right? And I just don't think any of that matters. In fact, I actually think that even like engaging with the question is sort of giving more to Zionist framing than we need to, right? Because I think it's just completely irrelevant. I mean, this the same way that for the United States, I would say, if your ancestors came over on the Mayflower, or if they, came over, from Eastern Europe as like early 20th century immigrants, or if they're Guatemalan Americans who took their citizenship exam last week, whatever, right? I don't care about that. Everybody should have completely equal rights, because just because they're a person, right? I mean, that's that all that should matter for being an American is being a person who's here. And so similarly, I don't care about any of that there. I think if you're sort of thinking about this in terms of competing ethno-national narratives or anything like that, I think you're just kind of missing the point. I think that all you should need to reject Zionism as an ideology is just a general rejection of ethno-nationalism, just a general belief in absolutely universal standards of democracy and human rights. That there are things that it's wrong to do to anybody anywhere, just because there's a person, they're a person, right? So if you have, I think that so to put to kind of make that concrete, right? Like how what that means on a brass tacks level. I think that if you're if you're making some family sit in a refugee camp for generations, because if you let them back in, you're worried that too many members of the wrong group would live in the country, or if you're doing things like rule over millions of people in the West Bank for almost 6 decades at this point without ever giving them citizenship rights in your country. Because if you did, then there would be too many of the wrong group, and you'd lose the ethnic character of the group. I mean, that stuff, I think can be rejected just on the basis of absolutely nothing but completely universal principles, right? I mean, if somebody, and I think a lot of people sort of overthink it, and a lot of people kind of think, okay, well, the way to oppose oppression is to adopt like a sort of ethno-national narrative of oppressed people, and that's where I really have a lot of sort of deep philosophical disagreement with some people I otherwise agree with about a lot of this stuff, which is just it's like, no, I don't think any of that. I think that just absolutely universal standards of equality and human rights are the way to criticize this. If somebody in America said, I mean, not that this is hypothetical, just go on Twitter any day. You can find people saying shit like this. But, somebody in America said, I don't think we should let in any more brown people because I think America should belong to white people, right? Then anybody who's even like a milquetoast liberal would think that that person was a fascist.
Yeah.
But then somehow, if you say, well, I don't think we should let in too many Palestinian refugees to come back to Israel because this should be a permanently Jewish country, then people will a lot of centrist liberals will sort of nod along to that, right? I think that's reasonable, and I think that the point we should really be emphasizing is that that's absolutely insane. I mean, there's no consistent standard where the second thing isn't as bad as the first thing. In fact, the second thing is worse than the first thing, because you're talking about people who either themselves, in some cases, there are people who are still alive, from the original ethnic cleansing in the 40s, or whose parents or grandparents, were ethnically cleansed from the country.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just to finish off on a personal note, you just touched
Sure.
on a lot of it just now in regards to your background in philosophy and Marxism and how that
Yeah.
shaped your advocacy for the situation in Palestine and for socialist alternatives. If you could just talk a little bit about that last part, I think that your background and your stance on that is pretty interesting.
Sure. I mean, do you mean like in the Middle East, or just kind of in general?
If we could use the Middle East if we could
Sure.
focus on the Middle East, that would be great, just
Yeah,
in regards
sure.
to this one conflict, and then feel free to expand.
Yeah, sure. Just getting clear on the question. Yeah. Look, I think that, I guess, just to be a philosophy nerd about this for a second, I would differentiate between two kinds of questions. One's an empirical question, like a factual question, like how do we understand what's going on in the world on a factual level? And the other one is a normative question. What do we think should happen? Right? And so I think Marxism is relevant to the first question, to the question of how do we understand the dynamics of what's actually happening in in Palestine or anywhere else, right? And then I think that that's sort of like what I was saying earlier about kind of thinking about the political economy of settler colonialism is certainly going to be relevant there, and I think certainly just thinking about the power structure of American society that can lead to the point where public opinion is just totally irrelevant to how the United States interfaces with this stuff. That or if it's not totally irrelevant, it's 99% irrelevant. It is just remarkably insulated from from public opinion. I think a Marxist analysis of capitalism can be very relevant there. That it's just kind of a bad joke to think that we're all going to have an equal amount of political influence when some people are Jeff Bezos and some people are workers at Amazon warehouses. And there are a lot more people in the second category than in the first category. And then as far as socialist alternatives, I think, again, Marxism is going to be relevant for thinking about, okay, how could we get from here to there, right? What are the historical possibilities that arise from getting from here to there? But I think that the sort of more normative question that different parts of philosophy might be relevant to thinking about is, okay, what do we want to happen? And I would say that something that even consistent liberals, never mind socialists, are supposed to believe in is that all people have certain rights just for being people, right? Sort of the liberal democratic basics, what Marxists call bourgeois democracy, that everybody should have a right to basically live their life, as they choose, and have some kind of democratic input into the society that they live in, and all of that stuff. And then, of course, socialists think that's not sufficient, right? That just having freedom of speech is a great start, but if some people like Bezos own their own newspapers and the rest of us, very much don't, right? That we can't just buy the Washington Post, right? Freedom of speech and freedom of the press only goes so far. If all of us, okay, we theoretically have democratic influence on the country that we live in, but if you're Jeff Bezos, you can threaten to move to move Amazon headquarters from one state to the other, and like the governor of the state and the senators and all those people will sit up and listen, and the rest of us just have no remotely comparable political influence, then it's kind of a bad joke. And so socialists think we need to go beyond that. We need to have a society that meets everybody's needs, materially, and where people have a meaningful democratic say over what happens where they work, and that we can all sort of, the resources that we all use to support our society, that we can all control those together. And of course, when it comes to Israel Palestine, I think the big thing to say about that is that that's a situation where even those liberal democratic basics yet haven't been achieved yet, right? Like that bourgeois democracy has not yet been achieved, because you have millions of people in the West Bank and Gaza who who are ruled over by Israel, who every aspect of their lives is shaped by this government, and they can't vote the people who rule over them out of office. I mean, to put it mildly, right? And people can't move around, without permission from this country, etc. So, I think that in the Israeli Palestinian case, like task one is just to achieve that liberal democratic bare minimum of equal rights for everybody. Now, when that happened, you wouldn't solve the problem, not just in the sense that capitalism is a problem, but also in the sense that, you would have a situation like South Africa today, where legal apartheid is gone, but there are still massive differentials in wealth and resources between black and white South Africans, because the effect of all those decades of apartheid doesn't disappear on a dime. And so even if you had what I would see as the sort of ideal solution, right? That you have a single democratic state for everybody. Even if that was somehow implemented tomorrow, you would still have these massive disparities in resources between these populations, and then there's a question about how to go forward from there, and what to do. And I would say the same thing that I'd say in South Africa. I'd say the same thing I'd say in the U.S., right? Which is that the path forward is democratizing the economy, and trying to bring about an equal society for everybody. Which, by the way, I mean, a lot of it's been crushed over the decades, but there is a whole tradition of Palestinian socialist thought that is as sort of marginal as it's become, right? That the Jacobin, I think, did a podcast series about it called Red Star over Palestine, and about the history of this stuff. And I would hope that in that scenario, that tradition would be revived, because I think that would ultimately be the way forward. But I I think you have to start out by just achieving democracy.
Absolutely. Ben, thank you so much for being on. Where can people find you and more of your work?
Sure. So I write regularly for Jacobins. That's jacobin.com. And you can find my podcast called Give Them an Argument at all the podcast places or YouTube.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. You too.